Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, we have talked about so far about solving quadratic equations using factoring, completing the square, and the quadratic formula. The only way that we have not actually talked about is graphing. So you can solve quadratic equations by graphing. How's that? So here's an example. X squared minus x minus 12 equals 0. Now this is a quadratic equation. One way of looking at this is you can pretend that it is a function. Okay, you can pretend that this is a function. So f of x or y equals x squared minus x minus 12. Of course not equal to 0 because then it won't be a function. So you can turn this into a function. Okay, you can turn this into a function. Now, the difference between function and this is, okay, if you look at the parabola, okay, I'm not going to draw this parabola necessarily, but if you just look at any parabola, okay, for any domain, there's certain range, right? So there's certain y value that corresponds to any given x value, this. So for this x, okay, this is the corresponding y value, okay? So, but we want to know when this y value is 0 right here, okay? When y is 0, okay, that corresponds to this x value right here and this x value right here. Here, see, over here, there are two y values. So this y value corresponds to this x and this x. And then over here, this y value right here corresponds to this x and this x value right here. Right? And if you keep going that way, the y is getting smaller and smaller. Here's y is like 1 or something like that. And then so for the one y value, the two x values corresponding are this. But for when y is 0, the y value is 0, the two corresponding x values are the x-intercepts. Okay, so this here represents an equation. It's an equation of the function which corresponds to y value right here, the y value being 0. So another way of solving this equation then is to pretend that it is a function, then graph the function, and then find the x-intercepts. Okay, so you take an equation, convert this into a function, graph the function, and then make your best guesses at the x-intercept. Let's do this. So let's graph this one. Alright, let's get rid of that. Y x squared minus x minus 12. Oops, here it is. So I've graphed this. Okay, now the way you would graph this, is, well, this is in standard form, so you would say Vx is opposite of b over 2a, and from this you would get the Vy, you would get the vertex, right? And then you would graph the vertex and axis of symmetry, and then you would get this, okay? So once you graph this, then you look at the graph and basically figure out where the x values are. Look at this one. For these two x values, notice the y is 0. In other words, when you plug in -3 and 4 into this function right here, you get the y value to be equal to 0. Which also means if you plug in -3 or 4 for x over here, you get a 0. Got it? So now a summary then, if you have an equation, okay, you can solve this equation by pretending, so to speak, it's a function, turning that into a function like this, then graphing this function, and then once you graph the function, then you find the x-intercepts. because the x-intercepts represents the values, the input that will give the output as 0. Okay, so that's the rationale behind graphing. Okay, so as a review, again, a quadratic equation may be solved. So as a review, again, sorry, there are 4 ways of solving quadratic equation by graphing. By graphing means you pretend it's a function, okay, and then you graph it, and then you look for x-intercepts. Okay, basically you guesstimate it that way. The second way is by factoring. And the third way is by completing the square. And the fourth way is by the quadratic formula. Okay, that's easy enough. Next time, I like to, in fact, before we move on with the rest of the chapter, talk about the quadratic formula, and shall derive the quadratic formula before we go on doing more examples with quadratic functions and equations. Until then, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, alhamdulillah, assalamu alaikum.